that's just kind of how we describe our denomination. All the evangelical yearly meetings in the United States, from coast to coast, are all dedicating one Sunday to talk about church planting. And this is the first time we've ever done this. And this is coming out of an awareness from bodies across the country of the need to start a new work in America, intentionally focusing on spreading the gospel here. This November we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of our missions organization, Evangelical Friends Mission. They have been doing the work for 60 years, going to countries across the world like Bolivia, Kenya, Rwanda, Bangladesh, India, and doing great work overseas. But there's also a recognition that the word needs to be spread here at home, and that we should make this a priority and to talk about it. So I was asked by Jim LaShawna, our superintendent, to talk about something related to church planting. And while I believe that church planting is very important and something that we can all be involved in, and that the yearly meeting should definitely be a part of, and that's part of our vision as a yearly meeting, is to be planting churches, I think the topic can feel like it doesn't quite apply to us individually, right? Not everyone is going to be a church planter, right? You might not be like, oh, that's not going to be me. Or maybe you're not going to be a part of a church plant either, right? Like if you're a member here right now, you're not a part of a church plant. Yet, I think that there's something even more basic and fundamental than just church planting that we can all be a part of, that can help us spread the word. And that topic is evangelism. Because really at the root of church planting, at the root of missions, is evangelism and preaching the gospel. It's a desire for it is the desire and the intentional action of sharing Jesus with those who've never heard, right? Church planting seeks to plant churches to reach people that they have never reached before at home, whether it be in a certain neighborhood or a certain city or whatever, or a people group. That's the whole goal of church planting, is to reach people for Jesus who have never heard. And I think that as churches, as local churches, we can kind of lose that fire, especially after we've been planted for as long as we have. Did you know that this building was a part of a church plant in the 40s? That somebody had the passion, it was a young woman who had a passion to start a Bible study around here so that people would know Jesus. And because of her fruits and the fruits of many others, we exist today. So many years later. It all begins with a heart to sharing Jesus with others. And so this morning, I want us to meditate about evangelism and preaching the gospel. And if you have your Bibles, please turn them to Romans 10, where we're going to look at verses 14 through 17. We're going to just look at a few verses this morning. I have to say, as a person, I love the sound, the tremble of Bible paper just being flipped. There's nothing quite like the sound. It's like that thin, crinkly sound. I love it. It's not quite the same as the warm glow of a smartphone, but it is also it's also a good thing too, right? I just like paper, personally. No judgment, though, because the thing is, like the word is the word. I just prefer it in print, but it is also nice to see the warm glow, the blue light too. It's good. Romans 10, 14 through 17. How then will they call on him who they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless someone is sent? It is as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Okay, Paul here in our passage this morning, to kind of like set the stage here, is making an argument within an argument in the letter of Romans. And one of the main reasons that Paul writes the letter of Romans was to raise finances and support for evangelistic work that he was doing in the Roman Empire. And in particular, that he had a desire to go to Spain. That's like the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire. And he ends his letter with this but now, this is Romans 15, 23 through 25. But now that there is no place for me to work in these regions, since I have been longing to visit you these many years, I do plan to do so when I go to Spain. So he's telling him, I'm like, the Roman church hasn't met Paul. He's in Jerusalem at this moment, and he's trying to raise support for them so that when he comes, he can stay there for a while and then kind of recoup, recharge, encourage them, and then he's going to go to Spain. And I hope to see you while passing through, that you may assist me on my journey there, after I enjoyed your company for a little while. So one of the main reasons he's writing this, I mean, there's lots of reasons why Paul was writing. There's not just like one reason why he wrote this letter, but one of these reasons was for missionary support. In our passage this morning, Paul is making an argument, this is his argument, to support him in missions. By making this an observation about the nature of the spread of the gospel. And like, how do people come to believe? And Paul's main point here is this, that people will not be saved or in other words, come to faith in Jesus Christ as Lord without the preaching of the gospel. It just won't happen. That we need to explicitly share with people the gospel and not only live Christ-like lives. And while it may be certainly true that, like, while we need to live lives worthy of the gospel of Christ, this cannot be a substitute for the actual preaching of gospel to others. And that God's not going to miraculously just save people if we don't show up. That he's asking us to partner with him, to go to people, to go to where the gospel hasn't been. And he does this through a series of rhetorical questions. And it's through these questions that Paul establishes a set of premises that create what I would call the logic of preaching the gospel, or gospel preaching. Or to answer the question, why is it necessary for us to explicitly share with people and not just live a Christ-like life? Why is it important to use words? I know that there's kind of a phrase that got popularized, it's like preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. But the truth is, words are necessary, and people often use that quote as a cop-out not to tell people about Jesus, because we're afraid of what people might think of us. So this is kind of Paul's argument here about why it's necessary to use words and not just our actions. And I think it's really important for all of us to understand this and be reminded as a church that we need to be on mission and that we need to be preaching the gospel because it has eternal significance. So premise one, Paul's first premise is this, that people cannot believe in someone that they never heard. I think this is pretty obvious, right? In verses 14, Paul asks two questions that are kind of related to this premise. And essentially is this: how can people call upon Jesus if they've never heard of him? Right? That's a pretty logical question, right? It reminds me of something that Donald Rumsfeld once said, famously after 9/11 happened. It was, if you remember those days, 2001, 2002, we were like going to war. And the Bush administration was making an argument about why we should go into specifically Iraq. This is a speech that he gave in 2002 about justifying the reasons why we need to go to invade Iraq. And he said this: "We know that there are no knowns. There are things that we know, right? There's things that we know, like the sky is blue. There's also things that are known unknowns. That is to say, we know that there are things that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, right? And I think this gives us a good understanding of kind of like our, just kind of like our range of knowledge, right? This is also known in psychology as Johari's window. If you want to like look this up, there's the things that we know, there's the things that we don't know, and that we're conscious of, and then there's the things that we don't know, like that we are unconsciously unaware of them, and to give an example of this, there are things that we don't know. Like, so for example, I know that I don't know how to fix my car, right? Like, there's like lots of things about my car that I know that I can't fix. I'm aware of my inadequacy here. I don't know, though, when my car is going to break down, right? I don't know, and like how many of us like don't know that there might be like something wrong with us if we like don't go to the doctor, right? I think a good example of this is like if you're not going to the doctor regularly or like checking your blood pressure, you might be having high blood pressure and not be aware of it. We need somebody to tell us that we're sick sometimes, to be like, oh, by the way, you have high blood pressure. You should probably think about changing that. Or you're getting up there, because there's some things in our life that we don't know that are hurting us or harming us, and we need somebody's outside perspective to help us. We all understand this concept that there are things that we simply don't know. The gospel of Jesus is like that, right? It's not we don't grow up just automatically knowing it. We have to have somebody to tell us. And if you grew up in a place or in a family that doesn't know Jesus, how on earth are you supposed to know? If you never had that experience, that how are you supposed to know? And I think for a lot of us, you might come from a Christian family who might talk about these things. But that's just not the case for a lot of people. When we can't take for granted that there are people who didn't grow up hearing the message of Jesus. And I think that for a lot of us in the West, we just kind of assume that, America's a Christian country, and we live in a Christian society, so then, therefore, I don't need to tell people about Jesus. But that's just, I'm going to tell you folks that that's not true. That people don't know, even in this country. And that it's actually becoming much more and more likely that you grow up not hearing about Jesus. There's some stats according to the Barna that it's by the year 2070, the majority of Americans will not be Christian. It's going to be 52%. And right now, 1 out of 3 don't believe in Jesus. And I know for a fact that this number is higher for young people. And if the young people aren't telling their kids about Jesus and passing it along, nobody will. And so there's going to be generations of people who don't know anything about Jesus. But that trend has been happening even today. So there's lots of people who stopped going to, their grandparents stopped going to church and never went back and don't know anything about Jesus. And even people who do go to church regularly might not have ever heard the gospel before. And here's another stat. So even though that 3 out of 10 of Americans don't claim any religious affiliation, this is even according to those who have a religious affiliation, half of Americans have read very little of their Bible. Okay, 1 in 10 have read none of it, which is a significant amount. That's 10%. Have like never read the Bible. And I don't blame them. When I was growing up, I never read the Bible. It wasn't until I got saved did I start reading the Bible. 13% of them have read a few sentences, and 30% have only read a few passages or stories, but like have missed the bulk of it. I think all of this points to the fact that there is just generally across the board in our society that people have very little familiarity with the gospel, even though we have an historical connection to Christianity. So we cannot take for granted that people know. We actually have to assume the opposite, that they don't know what they don't know. And this leads to Paul's next premise. Paul's second premise is this, is that people cannot come to believe without preaching. And we kind of see this in the latter half of 14 and 15. And I want to kind of take a moment to define what preaching is. Because when I say preaching, you probably, because we don't typically use this word, and we use it in a very narrow sense, and we typically assume of this, what I'm doing right now, right? Preaching is when somebody stands in a pulpit on a Sunday and speaks, right? Has a message, has a sermon. Or maybe if you're, depending on where you're at, you might see it on a street corner, right? That somebody's on a pulpit preaching a message, right? However, preaching in this context isn't we shouldn't confuse it with just simply like a narrowly defined idea of what preaching is. Preaching in this context is simply sharing a articulated belief. It's a shared, public, reasoned articulation of a belief, as opposed to a privately held belief where you don't share it with somebody. Okay. The Greek word here for preach means to proclaim or to herald something. It's to be loud and to be public, right? In public, not in the sense that like we're going to be debating public policy here, but like public as in people deserve to know beyond myself. Often, many of us believe things that we just keep to ourselves, right? We all have our opinions about things, and we might have our preferences about things. We might have our biases about things, but we just don't share them because they don't really matter, right? It might be as frivolous as your feelings about pineapple on pizza, right? People have feelings about it. You might not share it because you don't have to, right? And even if you have to, you might keep it to yourself because you don't want to stir the pot. Because, like, at the end of the day, everybody knows that pineapple does not belong on a pizza. But you don't want to stir that pot. And to be a little bit more serious, right? Like sometimes who we vote for president, right? We might vote for somebody for president, but we might not want to share this for a variety of reasons. And you might not be super articulate about the reasons why you might just like that person, and you don't want to stir up controversy, so you just kind of like keep it to yourself because it's like not a big deal, right? Like sometimes it is a big deal, but like I know in the last couple elections, who you vote for, it can be a really contentious thing, and we might not want to publicly share that, right? We don't want to be canceled. And so sometimes we just like keep it to ourselves. However, sometimes there are things that we need to share publicly because they're important. We need to often step outside of ourselves and share our opinions about things. And the thing is, we need to be ready to explain them and defend our belief on some level. You might not necessarily be the most articulate. You might not be the person who has the best argument. You might say something and they might have an objection that you might not be able to answer, but that's okay. But sometimes we might have to like share something as best we can. And what Paul's getting at here is that we need to be articulating the gospel. We need to proclaim. And that if we simply do not proclaim, people will not hear. And if they do not hear, they cannot be saved. Our faith must be proclaimed and put out there so that people have a chance to engage with it, to say yes or no, and not just keeping it quote unquote under a basket, right? And that people must go and be sent out to do this work. So I've been really getting into, I recently got into the history of the Titanic. I don't know if you've ever like fallen down this rabbit hole. It's really fascinating because it's one of the largest not naval, because that's peacetime ship disaster, right? You might be aware of the Lusitania, which was sunk during the World War, but this one just happened because it was just going and got hit by an iceberg, and there was like a whole set of reasons why like so many people died. Thousands of people died. Okay, it was a stat. If you were a working class man on the ship, your rate of you would die likely at like 92%, right? It's like a staggering number. And something that was really interesting as I kind of like have looked into this is that they had lots of lifeboats, and that they could have saved a lot more people, but they didn't. And that countless of people, like hundreds of people, could have survived that didn't, just because they simply like didn't get on the boat. That one, they didn't tell people to get on the lifeboats because they were like people were just like, oh no, the Titanic's not going to sink, and so they like didn't even try, which is like shocking to me. And then like the other people, they just didn't want to have people. And this was the one that was like so sad to me, was that there were upper class people that just didn't want the lower class people on their lifeboat. Just like take that to sit with that just a bit. Like they didn't want the riffraff on their lifeboat, so they just didn't put it on. And they would release people like that could hold, like I think there was I think each boat could hold like 70 people, and some of them, and there was only 20 of them. It was more than that. It was more than 70. But they would just like release them with like lots of space left. And it was only after the fact that after, they were waiting in the water for hours that they started to try to save people. That's tragic. And I think that oftentimes, I think our churches can be like that, right? That we have room for people on the lifeboat, but we just don't want them on. We don't want to take the effort to go bring people onto our boat. Granted, some people refuse to get on the boats, and that's up to them, right? That can be up to them to not get on the lifeboat. But the thing is that there are lots of people who would want to get on the lifeboat if it was given to them. If the offer was presented that, the ship is sinking and there's a lifeboat and you can get on. You just need to come with me. And that's the way the gospel is often, right? That this is the eternal stakes of the gospel, is that without believing in Jesus, we are condemned in our sin. And it's not that we are condemned because we haven't believed in Jesus already. It's that we are condemned because we live in sin and we have a broken relationship with God. And that all of us, and this is even though that we have a propensity to sin because of Adam and Eve, all of us have all fallen short at some point. All of us have chosen to live away from God. And it would be negligent of us not to want to go tell people about Jesus. It would be like having the lifeboat and being on the lifeboat and being like, I'm cool with 17 on my lifeboat, even though that we could have 300. We could rearrange the furniture. We could all just get a little bit more uncomfortable. In our society, and I think that this is also key. In our society, we have to work a little bit harder to proclaim our faith. We see this occurring in our increasingly secular and pluralistic society, that we want to marginalize Christian truth claims. We want to marginalize the gospel. And we've, as a church, kind of lost confidence in the gospel as a public truth, as something that is deserving to be proclaimed. It's to be an option. That is as a truth, it is universally relevant to all aspects of life. And if what Jesus said is true, then it does apply to all aspects of life. And while we as a church may not seek to, we might not seek to exclude all other voices and be like, we're the only ones that are allowed to speak, we should at least insist that our voices be heard, right? Like, we should insist on letting people know that the boat is sinking, even though maybe some people want to deny that fact. And this can only occur if we are willing to bring our message to others, if we're willing to become uncomfortable, to be seen as a little weird. And I get it. As a person, like, I have, as personally speaking, I am not like the most evangelistic sort of person, and I don't like conflict. I don't like being weird. I sometimes will purposely not tell people I'm a pastor because people get like, ooh. So I get it. And like, I have not been on the evangelism like train for the majority of my life. But I can understand how it can be uncomfortable. But if the claim is true, if we believe that people will be separated from an eternity from God, then if we truly believe that, then it should change our behavior on some level. And especially if we believe that the only way that people will hear is if we tell them. That's something to think about. And then this leads to Paul's final premise, that faith only comes from hearing the message of Christ presented verbally. In the final step of kind of Paul's logic, he kind of pulls the threads together for us. If a person has never heard of Jesus before, they can only hear Jesus from them by somebody sharing them, by preaching to them, kind of getting out of their own personal space into another. And therefore, faith can only come from hearing the message proclaimed, right? That the way we have faith is by somebody telling us. And I think that's true, right? That if like all of us in this room know Jesus because somebody told you. Whether it was growing up, it was a grandma, maybe it was growing up that you went to church a few times, maybe it was your spouse, maybe it was, a brother, maybe whatever it was, that there was somebody who had to tell you about the message of Jesus. Maybe it was somebody inviting you to church for the first time, and you came and you sat in a pew and were like, oh, wow, I've never heard this before. We all learned it from somewhere, even if it was the most cultural, like I remember hearing about the Passover story from Rugrats for the first time, right? It even then it required somebody to tell me. In verses 17, we are told this: faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. And interestingly, the word used for word in this passage is the Greek word rhema, and that is. This is important to point out because in biblical Greek there are two different kinds of words for the word that are translated for our English word. And primarily the two words used in Greek for word is logos and rhema. And they each convey kind of a different idea. Logos tends to convey the idea of thought or reasoning or logic that can be hidden or expressed. So, for example, when in the Gospel of John, when it says, in the beginning there was the Word, the Logos, speaking of Christ, what John's trying to get at is that Jesus is the underlying logic to the universe, that he's kind of the reasoning behind the universe. Whereas in rhema is a word in this context that usually means something uttered or articulated, whether it is spoken or word or written down. This phrase is to be explicitly explicit. It's like emphasizing the articulatedness of this message. The focus here is the nature of the expression, What Paul is getting at here is that faith comes from an active communication. It's from one person sharing to another person, and a person hearing and receiving it. And from hearing here, it's not simply just like have the words just like pass over the person. It's having the words like embed in a person, that they hear it and they're changed by it, from accepting it, from to being like the gospel is true and I'm going to live by it. And this is just the pattern of the Old Testament. And this whole pattern of gospel preaching and the salvation through gospel preaching is the pattern in the rest of the New Testament. God uses people as his instruments to share Jesus with other people. And it's through that people are saved. That God intentionally partners with us to share the gospel. That he chooses us to be his vessel for salvation to occur. And we see this throughout the book of Acts. Though one story in particular I think is really important to point out. And it's in Acts 10 with Peter and Cornelius. And here we have a picture of Cornelius, who was a virtuous and God-fearing pagan. It talks about his deeds of giving and almsgiving, that he really cared. He would be your person who would be like, he was your really good person who didn't know God. And we can know all these sorts of people, right? We know those people who are like excellent, lovely, moral individuals who do a lot of good things. Who you'd be like, wow, like they are stellar. Cornelius is full of good works, such as almsgiving to the poor. And he even we even see that he's spiritual. He prays. And during this and as he's praying, God remembers him. And then the story shifts a bit to Peter, where he's having what I call his crazy pig in a blanket dream, right? That like he's having this vision of this spread, all these animals on a blanket, and then God's like saying, like, go and kill and eat that pig. And Peter's like, hold up, God. I've been kosher my whole life. I'm Jewish. You know the law that you put out. I'm not going to do that thing. I've never eaten anything unclean. I'm not going to start now. And God's like, no, go kill and eat. And he does this 3 times. And then Peter realizes that God's not telling him just to go eat some pigs. He's saying to go and spread the gospel to the Gentiles. And so he goes to Cornelius. That God sends him to Cornelius, which at one point Cornelius himself is expecting somebody, because he had a spiritual experience of an angel saying that there's this guy named Peter who's going to come speak to you. And so he's been waiting. And so when Peter arrives and Peter preaches to Cornelius, Cornelius falls down and is saved and is baptized. And is baptized by the Holy Spirit, and he comes to know the Lord. And I think this is a story because it shows us something important, is that one, God is working in the lives of people that we don't know. He's preparing their hearts to hear. And that there's lots of people out there who have a spiritual connection with God, who are earnest, but they're not quite there yet. And God, while he's working on his heart, needs to work on our hearts as well. That Peter, he was resistant on wanting to go and share with the Gentiles, which, like, Peter was cool sharing with the Jews, but he didn't want to like get out of his bubble. And the truth is that he needed to be pushed a little bit, to go and to speak to people that were a little bit more different than him. And then when he did, God worked through Peter and saved Cornelius. And I want to point this out, that it could have been a lot easier for God to like save Cornelius, right? Like he was already like 90% the way there, right? He could have sent the angel and be like, yo, Cornelius, there's this guy named Jesus, you haven't heard of him. If you just follow Jesus, you'll be saved, right? God sent an angel to him, but he's like, nope, you got to wait for Peter. God, and I think that's important for us to see, that God just doesn't just goes like, boom, you're saved because you're a really good person, right? that God uses us to share Jesus with people. Because that's what in some ways, that's a pattern of what Jesus did. Jesus, who came from heaven down to earth, dwelt among us to tell us about God. This is the pattern. To embody salvation, to embody the gospel. What we see here is that the eternal destiny of an individual, Cornelius, and their salvation hangs on the balance of those who are willing to preach, right? Cornelius would have probably never been saved if, like, Peter didn't obey. Preaching the gospel saves, and God has elected us to partner with him to preach the gospel to win souls. Faith comes from hearing the gospel explicitly preached. And while this is simple, it can also be difficult. So I have a few kind of like application points for us so that we can all be engaged in the work of evangelism. Because I think that there's a myth that just because like that it's like this. I'm not a naturally gifted evangelist, and I don't have the gift of evangelism, so then that gets me off the hook from evangelizing, right? Like we like to think of this as I kind of like if I'm not talented in this area, if I'm not proficient in this area, it's very like business culture sort of a deal. Like, you know, you take your Strengths Finder test, and if you don't have the like Strengths Finder of evangelism, you're kind of off the hook. That's not the case, people. Because the thing about a spiritual gift is that it's precisely because you haven't earned it. That God will work through you whether you feel good at it or not, right? That God will choose his people to work through. So this is what we can do. First, we can pray. We can and specifically be praying regularly for evangelism and moments to share the gospel with people. Jesus himself directs his disciples to do this in the Gospels. Matthew 9:37. Then he said to the disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." I think this prayer is important for two things. And I think that this prayer isn't so that God can just like raise up somebody else to do the harvesting. I think it's really to work on our hearts, to help us see, it helps us hone our attention to really see the condition of the world. That there are moments of evangelism around us every day. And I think that the second part of this prayer is important is because it prepares our hearts to be laborers, right? God, through our prayers, will answer that prayer. And I think that his answer to the prayer is to move us to work. When we are continually praying for evangelism, you'll be surprised about the opportunities that will open up to you if you're simply just willing to listen to the Lord as he directs you. And I've seen this in my own life. So like I said earlier, I joked that like I haven't always been on the evangelism bandwagon. And I always was like, I want to be like, I don't want to be offensive, and I don't want to I just want to let my light shine before people. And I think I used that as an excuse for too long. And so I started recently feeling convicted about that and started praying for moments of evangelism. And I have been surprised at how many opportunities that I've had in the last year, because this has been really a year that the Lord has been really working on my heart in this area. And particularly, I'll go into places and I'll be like, Lord, like, why don't, if you can open up an opportunity. And I've had them at bars, I've had them at coffee shops, I've had them at the gym, and sometimes I haven't been prepared for them whatsoever. And I have failed, and I didn't actually get to evangelize, but because I got too nervous, I've had my failures, and I think that's okay. But I think that the point was, as I prayed about it, the more I've seen it, the more that I've seen it. I remember recently, this past week, I've been praying for this, and there's somebody who I go and work at a coffee shop regularly, and I've come to hear the stories of people's lives, and I've recently found that the two people that I talk to regularly, they don't know the Lord. And while I didn't have an opportunity to share right then and there, I was like, oh, okay, I've been developing this relationship, and not just because I love them, but like realizing like, oh, I could in the future might have an opportunity to share with them. And this leads me to my next point, that if we are praying for evangelism, I have found that God answers that prayer. There are some prayers that you pray and you're like, will God answer that prayer? Like, maybe, maybe not. I think when you pray for evangelism and you pray for an opportunity to share with somebody, God's pretty quick in answering that prayer. And so we need to be prepared. 2 Timothy 2, 4:2. Preach the word. Be prepared in season and out of season, right? We never know when we're going to like find ourselves in a situation where we're going to like have to like tell people about Jesus. And so it's important to be prepared because we're only as effective as we are prepared, right? We know this in like in a crisis situation. If you're not prepared, you're not going to do anything, or you're going to, I remember when a few years ago when we had the big ice storm, we didn't have a generator, we didn't have power for 2 weeks. It was very hard. So now we're preparing. Me and my wife are like trying to find like alternative fuel sources. We have a generator. We're thinking about getting a wood stove so that like if the power goes out again, we're not going to be miserable, right? You're only as effective as you are prepared. And we'll miss out on a lot of opportunities if we're not prepared, and we're going to feel really bad about it. And so the good news is we can start preparing. We can start preparing for evangelism, even if we don't know if we're going to do it. And this can take a lot of forms. And I think that there's three, for us that we can like work on. First is simply just being willing to like share your story with somebody. I know something that I worked in outreach before, and one of the things with outreach is be willing to have like a script. Like I did outreach to homeless youth and tell you what, if you want to talk about like difficulties, I had to go into middle schools and talk about like homeless youth services as like an adult. And like one of the worst environments in the world is a middle school cafeteria. And like if I can do that, I think all of us can probably evangelize. But one of the things that I had to do is I came up with a little script before I even stepped inside the cafeteria. I had like my little message. And so just take a bit, if you don't even know your own testimony, think about it. Try to articulate it and try to make it, pretty short. Share your story. Be willing to share how Jesus has changed you in your journey with God. And our testimonies are powerful. We are told in Revelation 12:11 that we shall overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. Right? There is a power in just simply sharing your story. When we tell our stories, it fleshes out the gospel, and people can see its power. Second, we can prepare, and this doesn't even require you to be like an intellectual person or even good with words. You can just simply be available to invite somebody to church. You'd be surprised at the power of an invitation where the gospel is preached, right? We can create our church to be a gospel preaching church, and in simply inviting somebody, they can hear it. If you don't feel ready to share, this is an easy and effective way to evangelize. According to the Billy Graham Association, 85% of people came to church the first time because of an invitation. So if they like 85% of them responded to being like, yeah, I'll go. That's how they showed up. It wasn't just like, that's the vast majority of people. Most people don't come to a church because they just like see it, or they're like, I should probably go to church. Usually it's an invitation to a specific local church. 85%, that's a huge percentile. And third, I think this is something that we can all do, is we can be prepared to give a reasoned defense for our faith, for Christianity. So often, as I have found in my misadventures in evangelism this past year, that when I start talking to people, I found that the objections to Christianity kind of become, how should I say this? They become repetitive. That there are common objections that people have about Christianity, and people aren't original when they bring up an objection to the faith. Some are, how can you say that Jesus is the only way? Or isn't Christianity homophobic? Or doesn't Christianity hate women? Or doesn't the science disprove the Bible? Being prepared to answer some of these questions. And I think that like the questions that and the objections that somebody may ask kind of depends on their context. And You don't feel like you have to like be an expert, because that can be really overwhelming. But you could probably, you know, if you have a friend who's just like, I don't like Christianity because of this reason, then you can like think about that and maybe read a book. Some books that I think are really helpful in regards to this one is Confronting Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin. She kind of does she does excellent work. It's published by Crossway, so if you want to buy that on Amazon, I highly recommend that book. And she does, answer some of these questions, and I think in a really compelling way that is not rude, or she takes the objection seriously. And another one's just Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. It's a classic. It's very well articulated about like the reasonableness of Christianity. So those are two, if you want to like research, these are some good resources. And then this is the third point, and I think that this is pretty obvious, is that after we have prayed and prepared, we need to actually preach. We actually have to step forward and be uncomfortable. We need to be confident and bold with our gospel message. And this is probably the scariest thing to do, but it doesn't have to be. Because I think many of us have fears of being insensitive or offensive or a Bible thumper or a weirdo. But if you're already like aware that you're trying to be sensitive, like people aren't going to like think that you're insensitive, right? Because the world has no other problem with people passionately articulating their beliefs on all sorts of things. The world has no problem with gospels, and they're being preached all the time. In the evangelism classic, Out of the Salt Shaker into the World, Rebecca Manley Piper observes this: most people respect and respond to a person who has definite ideas and communicates them clearly, rather than someone who seems apologetic or like sorry or wishy-washy. And then in the context, she shared her story as an international student in Spain. She noticed that there are tons of Marxists on her college campus in the 80s who were preaching the gospel of Marxism, just saying that and evangelizing their college campus with the radical ideas of Marx with zeal. And a lot of people responded positively. And they were responding positively just because they had conviction. They were open to hearing somebody who really believed in something. How many of us just and this is true even though communism has resulted in the death of more people in the 20th century than any other ideology, right? We can look at the track record of communism and go, oh, it's pretty bad. But it's compelling for people because people believe it fervently. And when you ever met somebody who's actually believes in something, it can be inspiring. It can be encouraging. It makes you want to believe too. We shouldn't be afraid to share boldly our gospel, because it isn't offensive to have confidence in your beliefs. And I think that is a message that we hear that gets leveled against Christians, that if you have confidence, then you're just being offensive. And that's just not true. Especially if you want somebody else to believe them. You have to actually believe. You actually have to have some confidence in them. Because otherwise, if you don't have confidence, why would anybody else want to believe? The truth is that people are lost in yearning for truth. People are lost in yearning for direction. They're yearning for gospel in the end. And unfortunately, they're willing to follow anything, if people are just convinced enough. If this is true for false gospels, whether they be political ideology or cultural messages, how much more for the true gospel, right? And then I think finally we can give, right? That we can be generous in the work of planning churches and planning in missions. And so when we think of evangelism, it's not just simply just one-on-one stuff. We want to invite people to things. And that requires money. That requires people to do the work. It requires for people to come to places, because it's not just good enough to tell somebody the gospel. You have to bring them somewhere. And so participating and giving to a local church or a church plant can help with that work as well. And that gets them connected and gets them connected to the body of Christ. Because faith isn't just an isolated thing, it's a corporate thing. And when we come together as a flock, that's when we are more successful. So we're inviting people not only to believe in Jesus, but become part of the body. So by giving sacrificially and generously to a local church, or even to the work of church planting, that also helps in the work of evangelism. People are hungry to hear the truth of the gospel of Jesus. And that though that we are sinners destined to death, God loves us and sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to the world to die for our sins, and then destined all of those who believe to life. Right? God has made a way through Jesus. No matter how good we think we might be, or how bad we might be, or and no matter how much we want to live like Christ, the only way people will ever come to believe in Jesus is if we tell them about Jesus. People will only believe if the gospel is preached. So, with that, let us pray and prepare and to preach the gospel boldly. Heavenly Father, we thank you for coming to us, coming from heaven, coming to earth to live among